So good night, everyone. Very happy to be here. My name is Geneviève. As we were just saying, I'm the co-founder of the Centre Mosaïque de Québec. So we are a Speech-Language Pathology Clinic. We're located in Quebec City, but we are, we have been working with communities outside of the city a little bit before COVID, and now even more since everybody, let's say the limits are not what they used to be now that everybody's used to doing stuff online. So we started the clinic in the aim of offering services to, let's say, bilingual and multilingual people who live in the province. There's really specific needs, and there's just a different strengths, and once in a while, just a few weaknesses that can come with, uh, you know, evolving in with two different languages. So our aim was really to inform people, try to uh, go against the hard myths with bilingualism, and work with, the communities who need people who are linguistically and culturally sensitive. So that was our aim with the clinic. Today our talk is supposed to be about bilingualism and literacy. So literacy can be about pretty much, it can, like, we can think about literacy from preschool years, even just as babies, until really the end of high school. So, and depending on the interest of everybody here, we can focus on preschool or school years, depending on the questions and where the night takes us. Usually I like to do a roundtable, have everyone bring why they're here, but that's gonna very likely take a good while. So keep in mind that I want this workshop to be as, dynamic as possible. You can ask your questions as they come. And just to get started, maybe if you wanna, I would be curious to know um, what myths you have in mind if we talk about the myths of bilingualism, and what is a myth that you know is not true, either from experience or that you read about it. So we can either use the chat box, or you can say it on the microphone. That would be okay as well. So I'm curious to know, what are the myths you know are not true about bilingualism?
I can break the ice. I have heard, but I don't believe that when a child is learning two languages at the same time, it delays their learning of one or the other language.
Yes, thanks for that, Audrey. And we also had a question from Mary that goes along the same line, that children would not learn a language well. And it's actually, if we look at the population of children worldwide, there are more children who are exposed to more than one language than monolingual children. So it's, in a way, it's kind of the norm to be bilingual. And children learn at a very young age that different people speak different languages. So it's not something that's going to cause confusion. And it's widely recognized by now that, if we have a kid who struggles with language, he's going to struggle whether he's exposed to one or five language. The root cause is never being exposed to many languages. I would say that there are many advantages of being bilingual from a very young age. But the only, let's say, thing that you could see as a downside is that usually when kids develop their vocabulary, they tend to learn some words in a language and some words in another. Sometimes the environment is perfectly bilingual and they're just as exposed to the concepts in both languages, but most of the time it's either maybe a little bit more of a language with in a context, for example, at daycare or at home or with the grandparents. So some of the words they're going to learn in one language at a time. So if you look at the size of the vocabulary in either language, it might be a little bit smaller, but if you put the two together, and that's why you need to look at bilingualism in the different way, you have to take everything they know, then typically they have a bigger vocabulary than a monolingual children. So there's actually a lot of upsides, and it's also something that helps kids develop what we call the theory of mind. So we're a very basic form of theory of mind. So the theory of mind is being aware that there are things that you know that other people don't know. So being aware that you might speak a language And maybe daddy also speaks 2 languages, but grandma speaks only 1. And they understand from a very young age that they have to pick specific language or any language to talk with some person. So that's also why a lot of the time kids are going to do what we call code switching. So that would be putting 2 languages in the same either sentence or when they talk. And that's actually totally normal. And that's something that we do a lot as adults. It's just that we don't do it as much because we know that you look maybe a little bit, you're going to sound like Justin Trudeau if you do, and nobody wants that. But kids really tend to do it. And it's actually very well suited when they know that the person understands both languages. So they go with the path of least resistance. So that's something that's totally normal and not to be worried about. So all in all, the main upsides of being bilingual is that you have a little bit more flexibility and understand that people don't all function in the same way. And basically with language is just pluses. So thanks for going with that. Any other myths that you have heard or that don't like hearing about bilingualism? Well, that is definitely the big one. And it used to be the case that a lot of speech language pathologists, people do the same job as me, used to recommend to parents that they don't speak 2 languages at home. And that every time I hear something like that, it breaks my heart because it's really advice that is outdated. And frankly, that is very limited and very sad to take away a language, because it's not just the language but it's also the culture. Sometimes it's the language that they're going to use to communicate with the grandparents, and it's also tied to a lot of values. So a culture cannot really be separated from language, so it's just more realistic to accept that there's more than one in most people's life. I was wondering also, since we're going to be talking about literacy a lot, if some of you think that books are still or are not still relevant, considering that there's so much more options now with everything that has a screen. What are the pros and cons of books? If we still need books, or if we actually shouldn't really miss them? Books are really relevant. I tend to think the same as you, Maria. Of course, we wouldn't tend to do that, but it is true that it does bring images to words. I'd be curious if somebody here would like to share, let's say, a nuanced point of view. What are, maybe you realize that your kids aren't that interested in books, but they can be interested in what we call literacy anyways with other formats, and it's really great that they're here. Or maybe not as much. Well, it's great if everybody likes books. So one of the good ways to start this workshop would be to start with the younger kids, which means talking about early literacy.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you for one moment because someone asked to please explain what you mean by literacy in other formats.
So that's a very good question. Literacy in other formats would be anything that resembles a book, but can be, for example, on a tablet. So if we think about ebooks, or some people, have completely, or some adults will not be using books anymore because they got a tablet that functions just as well, or that's actually much more convenient, because then you don't need, if you're reading a big book, you don't need to have it and have such a burden. So some people are just really much better off, or there are audiobooks as well. So there are more and more for kids, and a huge inventory to choose from for anybody. So really books have really adapted to technology. So there's a lot of fun in being able to manipulate the book, but the options and the interactive still. Motor skill, somebody's asking about the motor skills of manipulating.
No, I wasn't asking. That was my comment. And
okay.
you mentioned that at this very same moment.
Great. So I'm not sure. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this?
Well, you were just about to, so I'm going to let you do it.
Oh no, actually, I was reading your question.
Oh no, well, I think you started talking about with a book. There's the skill of turning the pages, of holding the book, and that develops motor skills when a little child is just manipulating the book itself.
Yeah, well, so of course I would go with more the so manipulating the book itself is not something that you cannot get any from anywhere else. So I wouldn't be saying that, for example, if you don't manipulate a book, you're not going to acquire the motor skills, because very often you're still going to use some form of paper for everyday life, whether it be for a recipe or for reference. I think even if it doesn't come from book as literacy, it's going to come from other type of paper that you need to manipulate. But what would be the real upside of having a real book is that it's much calmer than something on the screen, which can be a big upside as well. It's not as interactive, but life goes so fast and we're always on screens and we're so conditioned to having our attention span to we don't tolerate even 2 seconds of unstimulated attention anymore. And it's true for adults and it's true for kids as well. So having the book is really a good way to just slow down and remember that we don't need to have something that's backlit or that's going to be moving or making sounds all the time. So I would more go with the lo-fi side of the book that's also making us slow down, which is something that we tend to forget about as well. There's a lot of people who advocate for boredom in the sense that you get to be more creative and you get to have other type of thoughts if you're bored than if you're constantly stimulated. So I guess that in a way the change of pace could be something that's really interesting. So let's start with the something is asking a question about how blue light affects children. So, as far as I know, the problem with blue light is that it's something so there hasn't been a lot of studies about it. So, what they know, as far as I know, it's not necessarily something that's going to be more harmful to children than for adults. It's just that it's going to make people's eyes more tired. But I don't think there's anything that was really demonstrated as an obvious upside that could downside that could be attributed to blue light only. It's really hard to tell if it's something else that contributes to the problem that people say they have from screens. So in that matter, I'd say we don't have enough information as far as I know. But it sure is a good idea to disconnect, because whether, I think that even before thinking about the blue light, just the fact that when you're interacting on a screen, you don't have the same richness of interaction as when you're with somebody else. Even if you're talking to someone, just having the nonverbal, being in the same space, also brings another dimension of communication that we really need, not just for emotional purposes, but for that kid needs as well. So I would say that trying to follow the guidelines for screen time in order to get the right amount of social interaction in a day is going to be a major reason to do it. So blue light just adds to that if there's a danger at all. Somebody said that having books in home makes literacy more available. That's absolutely true. Having books and seeing adults reading books as well is really a good way to show them how useful they are, leading by example. And exactly, somebody is also talking about how screens affect sleep, and that's true that is true for everyone. It's not very good to have a screen at least an hour before bed. That's what a lot of people are saying. Good. So about literacy and preschoolers. So really, I'm sure many of you have been reading books to your kids even way before they started to read. And so you know that, of course, books are going to be useful, not just for the quality of time that you spend together reading, but it's really modeling that you read from left to right and from top to bottom, modeling that letters have a purpose, showing that, for example, when a character is speaking, that's how it looks, showing that stories have beginning, middle, and end, showing that when there's a problem, how can we solve it? A lot of the time there are values in the story. So all of those things are really things that kids are going to learn when they read books with adults. So the fact of being with an adult that's going to add more information, that's going to make it more fun, really is the big added value to reading with kids. So there are not just the basic knowledge of print material in books, as I was saying, understanding that how books work, but also realizing that books are something that are used in everyday life and that are important. By reading a book, uh, every time you have an occasion, you're showing that it's something that you value, that you find important, and that you encourage doing, at different ages. So it's really a good way to bond and a good way to show them, to share your love of reading. Of course, it's also going to be very helpful for vocabulary. There are a lot of stuff that we're not going to be talking about it at home, but vocabulary that kids are going to be exposed through books. If you think about fantasy, many other types of animals that we wouldn't see, sometimes it's really a good option to use books to try to deepen their knowledge about emotions. It's not so easy to stop and talk about emotions every day, and that's some more nuanced stuff. For example, was he surprised? Was he discouraged? Those more specific emotions, for trying to elaborate a little bit more than just being happy or sad. As we were saying, books can be a good way to just slow down. So taking the time to talk about what happened to a character, why is he feeling like that, what could be a way to fix this, how would you feel if you were in that position. Those are all ways to talk about emotions in a way that we don't always do in everyday life, or that we do a little bit more quickly because we have to move on. But books are really a gateway to do that. So I've been saying a lot of stuff just in a couple of minutes yet. If anybody has, any reflections, any question that come to this, please ask them as we go, because it's always more interesting to have them, while we're talking about it than towards the end. But at any time, if you have a question, even if it's a little bit far-fetched, you don't be shy and you can ask it. I'm really glad to have it a dynamic workshop and not just be talking the whole time, because I know you're here probably because you have questions as well. So I want to make sure that everybody goes home with questions answered. So that being said, we were talking about emergent literacy skills. So holding the book.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think someone would like to say something.
Hi. Maybe I'm jumping ahead, but especially when you're talking about reading to your child, I'm looking at this from the perspective of raising bilingual children. So with my children in a French, being raised in French schools, so we're trying to work on their French. And at school, they're really working on their French, and schools have asked if how we can support our child acquiring their French language skills is by reading to them. However, reading in English is very important to us. Which one would you prioritize then in the home in these instances to continue our practice of sharing our first language books with our children, or trying to include more French language books so that they can get up to level with their French skills at the school?
So that is a really great question. And as we were saying, there's a lot of not just myths, but let's say misinformation that goes around with bilingualism as well. Because the question is, what is the amount of exposition that kids need to be fluent in a language? And because, if they are speaking French at school and at home, then when are they going to learn English, right? So the problem is that if you switch mostly or entirely to French books, then you're not going to be reading any English books. And that's something that would be kind of sad, right? Because there's so many really awesome books that you want to share with them. And I'm sure that you want to read them too. So I would go in let's say maybe in a more see and well, of not just wait and see, but let's see that and that. So for a kid to be really fluent in a language, what the closest specific amount or number that research can give us is to talk about 30%. So what is 30% exactly? It's not they could not really quantify it. Is it 30% of the day, 30% of an hour, 30% of a month? Usually it's recognized, so you can see it as a general ratio for everyday life. If you have about 30% of exposition to a language, you're going to be fluent in it. So if you know that they're going to be in school full days in English, and days go by pretty fast. If they spend their whole day in French, you want to get that 30% at home for them to be comfortable and in English and being able to read and enjoy the books you have. So I would continue to, if I were in your position, I would continue to read the books in English that I want to share, that I enjoy. And if you see that they struggle and they need to have more guidance with vocabulary or maybe understanding sentences, then you can try and here and there focus a little bit more in French to make sure that do shared reading, because it's richer when they do it with an outlet. They get more information. So if you see that they need it, go ahead, and we want them to succeed in school, of course. But I wouldn't cut out the English books yet. And that's the same case for any, let's say, neo-Canadian parents who have a mother tongue that is not French or English, and they still want their kid to learn, whether it is Russian or Chinese that you speak at home. And it would be really such a huge loss to stop talking your language to your kid because you want them to succeed in school. You can, in most cases, you can have it both ways. And anyways, it shows that when they struggle, it's not going to solve the problem to remove a language. So I would keep going with books in English for as long as you enjoy them. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that question, or does that sound like a fair compromise?
No, that's great. I like the 30%. I can start doing some math and see how many languages I can throw in there with 30%.
Right, absolutely. And also one thing that we should keep in mind, and I'll move on with the other question. The best way to make sure the kids have exposition in both languages. So it sounds like it makes sense to try and translate right away, but usually it's best to try and focus on one language at a time, because it has a cognitive cost to go from one language to another. And kids don't have the same, they don't have the same power to do complicated stuff. So it's just the way it is when you're younger. So trying to translate from one, and let's say in the same minute, it's usually going to be more tiring than if you do, I don't know, we can read the same book once in English and then read the same book once in French, or you can, have a little bit of fun with that, which could be a good compromise as well. You take the books you really love in English, read them in English the first time, and then the second time around, you just read the same story, but in French. So that could be a way to make sure that they have both as well. So just to say, we want to expose kids to both languages, but try to do it one at a time is going to be more efficient. Somebody was also asking a question: what can we do when they struggle with pronunciation and understanding? So one is their parents, one's talking in English and one in French. Maybe some of you have heard about it, or maybe not, because people don't talk about it anymore, but they used to recommend one parent, one language. It had absolutely no credible evidence saying that it should be like that. It's just something that, I don't know who invented it, but it got around a lot. It's not necessary to have one parent, one language. You can, as we were saying, it's a good idea to avoid to being constantly translating from a language to another. At the same time, I don't think it's really something that's going to be a problem for a kid. Anyways, the person's question was more, what do we do if one person talks one language and then the other parent another? We can try to focus when the kids need a little bit more help with one language. We can try to focus on it trying to maybe have a little bit more of a structured approach. For example, you can have certain days of the week or certain moments of the day. That's how it works better. For example, we're going to have dinner in French most of the time. If we need to, if we want to have them be a little bit stronger, talking and understanding in French, it could be a way to do it. It can be bedtime is going to be in one language, or the story time is going to be in one language. Usually when kids are used to a certain way, they're able to, just the fact that things change also has a cognitive cost for kids. So when we make it predictable, it is easier for them to focus on language. So that's why the idea of a structure can be interesting. It doesn't have to be, a specific, very specific structure. It's just whatever works best for your family. So if you see that the kid has some sounds that he needs to work on, whether it's in English or in French, you can try to have, specific moments where you want to focus a little bit more on that. It doesn't have to be the whole day. It can be just 10 to 15 minutes, and a little goes a long way. And it's the same thing for understanding. So if you feel that they don't understand as much, let's just say directions or vocabulary in one language or another, then you can find a 15 minutes or less, just a moment every day where I can really focus on it a little bit more and carry on as usual for the rest of the day. So Pam,
sorry,
yeah.
Sorry. Can I make some mileage on that?
Of course.
Because actually, the problem I have, my daughter goes to an English school. We're in Trois-Rivières, which is French city, very well. It's close to you. And actually, I'm trying to, she's in grade 3. I'm trying to speak English with her several times, well, since 3 years now. And she doesn't want to speak English with me. Well, I don't know what to do. So
right.
I think like maybe supper time or story time. This is okay, story time, but supper time. I need some help on that. That's why I'm here today. So
right. Has she given you any reason why she prefers not to talk in English?
I don't know why.
Yeah.
At all. Maybe she's just a bit shy with me and not at school. I don't know.
It's hard to say, right? And it's so that's a tough situation because you don't want to have to necessarily go against her will, but at the same time, we will let kids decide when it's okay to take a bath or not. There are some stuff that we just need to impose. And I think it's okay to say, I want you to have, this is part of who you are, and you don't get to say that it's not going to be part of your life. So to try and introduce it in a way that works best, maybe if you, just brainstorming like that, maybe trying to find an activity that, she really enjoys, and bringing English in that way could help it a little bit more. If it's, going to shop for books and getting them in English, or going to see a movie together in English.
I tried that. Like we're playing Trouble Bubble and all kinds of games, board games. I'm trying to speak English with her. She understands everything, but she only answers in French. So I want her to answer in English, but it's like just one word, and then she ends the sentence in French all the time.
And that's the thing we can't control, right? If she decides to answer in French, not much to do. And I don't see any correlation as being any helpful. Not to say that's what you would be doing.
Maybe just continue like that, and maybe one day she'll.
I was just saying.
It's 3 years now. It's 3 years now, so maybe 1 year more.
And
one more year.
There's a lot of value in, having her, being exposed to English. And it's not just the fact, you don't learn from TV the same way you learn from a parent. Well, especially another person or just a parent is even more stronger. Kids, whether they like it or not, they're more sensitive to what happens with their parents, even if they don't like to say it. So you talking to her in English is also going to do a lot for her, having it in her brain and hopefully being happy to use it before long. But I would say I wouldn't give it up, as exactly as you do, trying to bring it with quality time as much as possible. And, you know, you're the adult, you can decide that this is, you know, as we were saying, this is part of who you are, and I'm just going to keep talking in English, and you can answer me in English when you want, and if not, I'm just going to keep talking in English.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome. You know, if we think about, and I'll get to
I'll keep up the good work.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, just to give you I have a very specific example of mine of someone I know whose mother is Vietnamese. And this is now an adult, but when he was a boy, the same thing. He didn't want it to be different. So he asked his mom to stop talking to him in Vietnamese. And now he's so sad that he doesn't know that language at all. And it's, you know, it's never too late, but now the amount of time that it would take for him to be fluent in Vietnamese is so much that he's just not getting into it. So he kind of lost the opportunity because his mother conceded him that, and now he really regrets it. So I think that you're doing her a service by continue to talking in English. I would see it that way.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just share
Yeah.
some anecdotal information. I don't have expertise, but with my daughter, and my daughter is much younger, so I don't know, you know, with the age difference between a child in grade 3 versus my daughter is 3.5. But I have always spoken to her only in English. I guess I listen to those experts who, the other speech language experts who were saying, you know, if you speak one language, speak that language all the time to the child, and so on. So I was always speaking with her in English, but because she was in such a francophone milieu, with the rest of our family is French speaking, and she goes to daycare in French. But one thing I would do with her is whenever I would speak to her in English, she would answer me in French, and I would repeat her answer back to her in English, because I didn't want to coerce her into speaking English, and I didn't want to make it unpleasant for her. So that's one thing I would do, would be to repeat back. And one of the kind of blessings of this pandemic is that during the lockdown, she spent so much time with me that she just switched over, and now she'll speak to me in English, and she'll speak to her father and her sisters in French. So I'm wondering if, like, I don't know, a vacation in English, you know, you have a week off, your family goes on vacation, maybe it's an English vacation, and then it's kind of by osmosis, you know, they start to integrate it without even realizing it. But that's just my anecdote.
Absolutely. No, thanks for sharing.
Oh, thanks. And just to mention, there are other comments in the chat, other questions in the chat.
Yes. So, and absolutely. So that's the best case scenario we're hoping for. We keep giving the input, hoping that sometime it's gonna all make sense and come together. Somebody was asking a question about what happens to a grade 3 child who writes a story on the paper in Japanese style, so from left to right or from ending to beginning. So this is something, you know, I was mentioning a little bit earlier that even if kids don't know how to read, they still learn a lot from books. So learning that reading is from left to right, or that we read a story in a way and not the other way around. So those are things that are part of book exposition from a really, really young age. So it is atypical in 3rd grade to behave like that. If it's the only problem that there is, well, very often trying to focus on this behavior, and I'm not sure if I guess that if the person asked the question, it's probably been they probably tried to give the right information that this is how you write, and it goes from the not ending to beginning. I would, you know, maybe what could be helpful is to try to have paper that is a little bit more structured, where it's really obvious where we should be starting and where we should be ending. In itself, you know, if everything with reading and writing is as expected for the age, but that the writing is just not in the right direction, it's not something that would be considered like a learning disability in itself, because really the most important components of learning how to read and write are there. It's just this odd feature that's there. So I would approach it more in a behavioral way and trying to focus on why is this behavior present? Is it any use for this child, and what are they trying to gain? Were they ever able to write uh, in a non-Japanese style, let's say? Camille, that was your question. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's my boy, and I was just surprised. It's not something that he does commonly. He brought back. Well, he didn't bring back. I spoke to the French teacher, and we're gonna have the assignment soon at school. And the French teacher said, "Well, it's funny because he gave me his story, and then he said, look, it's like a Japanese style of a manga."
Okay.
It's from the end to the beginning, because he just like, instead of starting from the first page, top page, well, he started from the last page at the end.
He's imitating another style of books he saw.
Well, I don't know. At the beginning, he wasn't. His mind was not on that. He just realized that he did it, and then he went to the teacher and said, "Look, I did it like the Chinese style." So the teacher said, "Well, okay." It was only once, but I would
say that's cute.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what the teacher answered. I was just curious, but it's not a common thing.
No. Yeah. No, it is really interesting, and it is like an odd thing that some people do. What is it? I know this is a really anecdotal, but I know somebody, a friend of a friend, and for some reason he started to write as in a mirror when he was in elementary school, and it lasted for a while. It's kind of like selective mutism. It's just a way to, of course, nobody's crazy. Nobody's trying to make their life harder. So there's a reason why this behavior came up. We have to figure out what's the reason and try to deal with the reason rather than the symptom we're witnessing. It doesn't, anyway, it's kind of cute, as we said, but if it would be a problem, I would try to see what's the behavior underneath.
Exactly. But usually when he reads some books, it's okay. It's on the right side.
Yeah, well, it's very nice though that he was exposed to different style of literacy, and that he even got to, maybe without realizing it, doing the same thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, super interesting. We have another question about learning new stuff at school is already hard for kids, for example, some math things. So they wonder how it will go learning things in a second language. So it's also really okay to prioritize. So usually the way we go when we know that kids have some challenges, either with the language or just some subject in school, usually we will focus on the stronger language and trying to build the new skills in the stronger language, and then seeing that it's still relevant, that they develop it in the second language. For example, I don't know if a lot of kids who will speak French at home but are schooled in English, or the other way around, if they struggle with math, let's just do math in the language that they're schooled in, because of course some other time in their life it's going to make sense to be able to do math in both languages, but maybe for a couple of years when they're learning new stuff every year, we can really just focus on the language that they use at school, aside from the really basic stuff that's going to be useful, like, I don't know, telling time or maybe counting money. But aside from the basics that's functional in everyday life, I would say that it's okay to prioritize and focus on the language that's most relevant in, and then you can try to bridge this knowledge to the second language. So of course, if you have a kid who's going to be schooled in French but talks English at home, and if you know that they struggle with reading and writing, then try to focus on reading and writing in the language that they're schooled in, and keep the second language as a bonus, trying to do as much as you can here and there. But if you feel like it's too much for you and your kid to try to be really good at both languages at the same time, it's okay to go with what's most relevant for the moment, knowing that there's a lot of stuff that's going to be acquired in a couple of years, and that's going to demand much less energy to work on. So it does make sense sometimes to, for example, let's just say the ability to do math in both languages, keep it for in a couple of years when the maths concepts are going to be much more anchored, and then it's going to be really much easier to transfer that knowledge to a second language, and trying to develop that new knowledge with both vocabularies at the same time. So Raymond, that was your question. Does that make sense with what you had in mind? Maybe if you want to comment on it later, it'll also be a good moment. So you had another question to expand on this question. So if they're learning, for example, math concept at home in one language, is it helpful that they're learning it in the second language, or would it be confusing? So I would go with what works well for the kids, because for a lot of them, it's not necessarily going to be a problem. Some kids learn vocabulary so quick that they're just going to automatically translate it. Or sometimes, for example, with math, it's not going to be that much different. You know, if we're talking, for example, addition, multiplication, a lot of concepts are really almost the same. So if you see that they find it easy to use both concepts in both languages, there's no way to refrain from doing it. Usually kids, you know, code switching is a thing. Sometimes the word comes up faster in the language when you're speaking another, and that happens, but it doesn't mean that you don't know how to say it. It's just that one came up faster. Most of the time kids are really, you know, they have the knowledge, and even if it doesn't show all the time. So I wouldn't be worried at all about confusion for concepts like that. If you see that they struggle in math, then it makes sense to really try and do it one language at a time. And as we were saying, you know, trying to develop the concepts when the knowledge is a little bit more anchored. But it's not going to be a problem to have it in both languages. And we were talking about adding new vocabulary on top of that, or should we just supporting the acquisition in the language of school? You know, I guess it just really depends of what you want to do on the weekend. Because if you feel like the homework they bring from schools is already more than the time you want to spend doing it, probably that's going to be enough. If you feel like it would be important that they try and do a little bit of both, a little bit of everything in both language, and, you know, add on top of it. But I think a lot of kids would really be happy to do that. It's okay to keep in mind as well that, you know, for most people, you're gonna be, or let's say that you work in a language, but then at home it's another one. Your vocabulary for work is going to be stronger in one language, and your vocabulary for everyday things is going to be stronger in the language you speak at home. We have a really functional way to use language, and it makes sense that kids do it that way as well. So Sue, I don't think it fit. Oh, Raymond was saying yes. Sue, I don't know if that makes sense with the question you had in mind. It's okay to respect the fact that we're going to support them in a way that helps them function as well as possible, but we don't have to keep score as are they just as good as doing math in French as doing math in English, or maybe that's not exactly what you were thinking.
I don't think it wasn't exactly where I was going with it. I'm not so worried about being able to do math in both languages. I think more, and maybe this is Raymond's next comment, is the second language is at school. So I think that's my situation as well, is that I am less able to support acquisition of concepts in the language of school. So what you had said earlier, for me was contradictory, which is support in the stronger language. So my child's stronger language is English, my stronger language is English. So we support it so we can, you know, discuss it and learn in English. However, in school, it's a different set. So I'm looking at juggling. Should I really be trying to learn the vocabulary so that I can support in the language of school? Or can we continue and then let her figure out how to translate when she's at school? Or does that put too much pressure? And I think Mary mentioned something that as well. Is once you're trying to learn math skills, is it too much? Then they won't really be able to solidify that learning if they're also trying to translate at the same time.
And
how much work do I have to put in?
Absolutely, and what a good question. So thanks for reframing that. So many things we have to keep in mind to try and have a better understanding. So first of all, there are going to be many there's no one good answer for every family. It really depends of every situation. The key things you have to keep in mind is that usually it's widely considered that after 3 years of being schooled in a language, usually we expect kids to be just as competent in that language than if they were the first language, as if it was a first language, or we expect them to do just as well in school. That being said, there are all, that's like the general idea. Not everybody fits in that. But it is enough exposition to a language to be able to, be competent in that language is cool. You were reaffirming also the fact that the second language is in school, but you talk English at home, and I guess it depends on the age of the kids as well, because generally their stronger language is going to be English, but maybe when they're solving math problems, there's so much more used to those concepts in French that maybe for math they feel a little bit more comfortable with French. And then working on the stronger language in math would be to help them with French. So it is usually it's not necessarily necessary to change school or change the languages that kids are schooled in to make sure that it works with what the parents speak at home. But it is important for parents to be able to, help their kids with homework. So at some point, if you realize that it's hard to help them with their homework in French, it might be a good idea to try and make sure that there's someone else that can help them with their homework at home, because it does make more sense. Let's say that they need help with their math homework. What makes more sense is to help them in French to do their math homework, even if you are more comfortable doing it in English. And if it's not possible, then maybe making sure that they have a tutor that can help them go over these concepts in French, because it's going to be more accessible for them to do it in the same language that they use at school. And some kids, they're really amazing and doesn't seem to bother them at all. So maybe you can talk in English while you try to solve problem in French. If that works, great. But if it doesn't, then let's just try to find help in the language that they're schooled in. That would be my advice. And it's really not necessarily easy, and it's not possible when we are in a global pandemic, or maybe there are less options. But that would be my way to think about it. Raymond, I don't know if that was also what you had in mind. And somebody was talking about their grandchildren. Yes, Raymond is saying exactly. So Mary's talking about her grandchildren who were in French immersion in Ontario, where math was taught in French. And after a few years, the educators began to realize that the students were not doing as well as they would hope them. So the math classes are now taught in English. And it also makes sense, to try to go with the stronger language. It's all, when you think about it, it's all a matter of what's the effort that you want to put in, for anybody. Sometimes with kids, if they struggle, if they have other struggles at school and it's too demanding to try and do math in both languages, then, maybe that's not a battle you want to pick. But maybe for other kids, that's really one of their area of strength and they don't mind doing it in both languages, then there's no reason to refrain from doing it. So I would really say go with what works best and with what makes sense. And Mary was asking, when do children realize that there are two languages for something like math? At what age? Actually, kids realize that there are two languages, or that there are many languages. I think even probably they gain that understanding even before they're able to put it into words. It happens at a really, really young age that they know that, language works like that, and language is not necessarily something that's completely unique. There can be many types of language. So I would go with saying that probably they're aware of it even before they get in school. And Mary, I don't know if that's going to answer your question, because maybe my answer is a little bit disappointing. Or not. Yes, so in a way, we could say that math has no language and there's just the vocabulary or the tags that we put on math. So in a way, I would go with probably the same logic that would apply with every other concept is going to apply to math. But there is a lot of this very instinctive and very visual with math that doesn't even need to be translated. There's a lot of stuff that a lot of mental operation we do with math, we don't even need words, right? So the math in a way is its own language. Maybe if something that could be interesting for the group, since we're talking about a lot of questions with school-age kids, would be to talk about what are the red flags? What are the things to look out for to know if you need to be worried about reading and writing? Would that be a topic of interest, let's say, to orient the talk? Very good. So I think that for that part, I will say it, but it's going to be more interesting if you're able to see the list and not just hear me saying it. So I can share you the list, which I can share with you, Audrey, that you can send to everyone after this talk is done. This is actually a little handout that's there to support the literacy and emerging bilingual children. So that would be for much, much younger, but the second part of it is with school-age children. So in grade 1 for reading, you want them to be able to create rhyming words, identify all sounds in a short word. So being able to break down the word in sound, like cat is k, a, t. They want them to be able to match spoken words with print. That makes sense. Understand what is read, and hopefully realizing that if they read something that makes no sense, they're gonna have the reflex to go reread it. That's something that happens a lot with struggling readers in grade 1. They focus on saying out loud the words and they don't have the reflex of reflecting, is this making sense? So that's something you want to look out for, making sure they're able to understand what they read. And have a side vocabulary of 10 common words. What we call the side vocabulary is really the words that you don't need to decode, that you recognize as right away as you see them, the very common words. For example, if you think about words such as like, you know, the GHT is something that we recognize the pattern. We don't have to go like to every time we read it. So that's something that we decode automatically because we recognize it. With print, with writing, wanted to print clearly, being able to read them, spell frequently, use words correctly, you know, the really common ones such as the, as, short or a little bit longer. Begin each sentence with capital letter, although that's something that they don't always do, and use ending punctuation. That's a good habit that they should develop at that age. You know, those are really the really basic things that you want them to do, and you could start to maybe seek help if you see that there are a couple of those that add up. But don't think that if there's one thing in the list that you don't see that it's necessarily a problem. You have to have a couple of those challenges before you need to really consider seeking help. In grade 2, they are going to be able to associate letters, sounds, words, and phrases with their written forms. So they get longer, and the numbers of, there's a lot of, there are even more in French, but there's a lot in English as well, of patterns that we need to recognize right away. For example, just the words just that's in bought, sought, all of those, that type of patterns that are very common that we need to kind of learn by heart. So those ones are going to be automatically, you know, remembered in grade 2. They want to be able to reread and self-correct when necessary and explain key elements of the story. And when we talk grade 2, it's not by the beginning of grade 2, but by the end of grade 2. So if they're working towards that, they're totally normal. With writing, we want them to identify new spelling patterns and words when reading, use a variety of sentence type, organize writing to include beginning, middle, and end. That's what we would like. A lot of them tend to maybe go in a direction and then forget to wrap it up at the end. That's not very uncommon, but we want them to be able to have at least a problem and a solution sometime in their writing when they tell a story. Spell frequently words, use words correctly, you know, kind of like house, words like that you have to remember, the silent T at the end and stuff like that, and progress from inventive spelling to more accurate spelling. So inventive spelling would be sounding out the words. If you read it aloud, you realize what's the word, but it doesn't look right. So they want to move on from that to accurate spelling. Any other questions so far? So I'll move on. I'll get back to the question in the chat that are not related with the red flags just after it. So we were saying in grade 3, they should have full mastery of basic phonics in both language. So that means, basic phonics is really the most common ones. And we want them to, for example, the vowel teams, being able to understand that EA sometimes is going to be E like in weather, but EA sometimes is going to be E like in team. So they should be able to recognize those patterns. Use word analysis skills when reading. So that means being able to break down the word in smaller parts. Ideally, that's what we want them to think about. For example, trying to understand that dislike is as the word like in it. And usually when we have this at the beginning of a word, it means something like not really or the opposite, for example. So maybe they won't have that knowledge, being able to explicitly say it like that, but being able to realize that there are smaller words in the words, that you can take up little prefixes and move them around, and that's going to change the meaning. We want them to be able to use previously learned information to learn about new topics and use clues from language content and structure to help them understand what is read. So a lot of the time we have to kind of read between the lines to fully understand. So that was something that we want them to be better at in grade 3. In grade 3, they should be able to write short stories and give brief reports of information, include some details, plan, organize, and edit their text, hopefully, and correct most spelling independently and use a dictionary. So that would be for the main goals of grade 3. Somebody's asking to scroll up. So here goes for grade 1 and grade 2. Pre-grade 1. So she was just asking to see what's happening before grade 1. So just to stay on the same track, I'll finish the red flags and then we can go back in time and look at the emerging language to make sure that you have all the information before, and then you'll get all of this, but it's always useful to go over it together. So in grade 4, we explain the author's purpose, but in a really basic way. For example, is it do they want to inform us, to entertain us, to convince us of something, persuade us? So understanding that text can have different purpose. Link information learned to different subjects. So trying to make connections with stuff you know about the world. For example, if you read a text about snakes, then you're already going to be thinking about what you know about snakes. Oh, they can be very dangerous, but maybe they're talking about a very common type of snake here that's not dangerous at all. So you're going to make connections with that. Learn meaning of new words through knowledge of word origins, synonyms, and multiple meanings. So that's really great for us, this stage where kids start to be able to reflect a little bit more deeply on the meaning of words. So they're able to identify the fact that words have more than one meaning. For example, if you think about like, it can be the light on the ceiling, but it can be something that's not very heavy. So being able to, being aware of those differences. They should be able to paraphrase context, to paraphrase content, including the main idea and details. So rephrasing it in their own words, which is something that struggling readers very likely will not be able to do in grade 4. We want them also to be able to develop a plan for writing and organize their writing to convey a main idea, hopefully. A lot of the time they're going to need to be accompanied to, to have prompts to complete a pre-writing activity, but they should be able to do it. Writes the effective stories and explanation, including several paragraphs about the same topic, and edit final copies for grammar, punctuation, and spelling. So that's what we want, what we hope to see in grade 4. Grade 5 and 6 should be to prioritize information according to the purpose of reading. So really trying to be able to tell the difference between main information and detail, describe development of character and plot, analyze the author's language and style, so appreciating what makes a good writing, and use reference material to support opinions. So they're able to say, this is what I think because of. They will be able to use variety of purposes, use specific vocabulary effectively, use many types of sentence structure. They can be complex, they can be, using conjunctions and a variety of conjunction, for example, telling the difference that so and because, and for example, using whereas, understanding that they mean an opposition. All of those are going to be strong in grade 5 and 6. Revise writing for clarity and edit final copies. This is the moment where I'm going to ask if you have any question before we move on to preschoolers. Looks like we can move on. So if we have a look at the milestone for literacy, that would be for preschoolers, really from a young age until they get to kindergarten. So first year, just showing an interest in picture books, even if they don't have interest at 1 year old, they're not lost. It's really it's not uncommon at all. At 2 years old, they know how to hold books the right way up based on the orientation of pictures and turn the pages. At 3 years, we want them to understand that printed words have a function, obviously not the meaning, but understand that adults read and it gives them information, so grasping that concept. At 4-year-old, we want them to think of simple rhymes. So this is something we do for fun, but it's also something that's really going to support the learning to read and write, because you have to, before you start to break down words in parts, you have to just being able to identify parts of words. So it starts with rhymes, that's the easiest part, and then they begin to be able to break it down in syllables and then in sounds. At 5 years, they know all sounds of the letters of the alphabet, or towards the end of kindergarten. So it's more important to teach the sound of the letters than the name of the letters. So the name of the letters is obviously useful, but the sound is really what's going to make a big difference when they learn to read and write. What we call the joint reading are exactly the good tips, the tips and just good habits to do to make reading more fun for everyone. So joint reading, I'll just finish the little part for joint reading and then we'll move on to a question about rhymes. So parental involvement in literacy is proven to be very beneficial to success in school. So usually because it adds up a lot of information to reading books. So it really has a great impact on their literacy development, and it helps them, value books and enjoy books, even if they're not the reading type right away. So, for example, some stuff that you can do during reading can be ask your child questions. As I was saying earlier, what do you think is going to happen? What would you do to solve this problem? Why do you think this person is feeling this way? Or, trying to reflect on why does this happen? What could be a solution? Or what do you think about this? Those are great questions to ask. You can identify and discuss new words. So if there are words that that they're not familiar with, it's a great idea to try and explore a little bit more. Oh, have you ever heard this? Oh, they use it in that context. What could it mean? Oh, maybe that has a meaning a little bit similar to this other thing, they know. You can try to use the picture also to reinforce that. So there's a lot that we can do with vocabulary. We can play with synonym and antonym games, trying to find words that have the same or different meanings. It might look like a little bit of a geeky game, but it can be fun. And have your child retell the story or retell it in its own words. So it doesn't have to be limited to books. It can be doing, for example, just with, can be showing that when you want to consult a recipe, you have to read it. Can be for, scanning flyers for special, reading magazines, exploring catalogs. That being said, you can't ask about feelings or problems with that type of stuff, but it still shows that reading is very important. Now we had a question about why it means by rhymes and how it may vary for French dominant children. So rhymes is just the same for everyone. Actually, what we call, well, when we learn to read and write, we need to be able to manipulate the sound. So trying to isolate them and put them back together. That's what we do when we decode and when we spell. And that's really across all languages. So it doesn't matter what language you speak. So the rhyme is just the really first step in that ability to isolate a sound in a word and recognize if they're alike or different. So that would be the same thing for French and any other language. So it's just as important for everyone, and you can do the same activities in both languages. Does that answer your question, Sue, or did you have
I don't think so. Or maybe I didn't quite understand you. It was your note there is that by the 4 years old thinking of simple rhymes, it can vary for French dominant children. So why would it vary for French dominant children and not English dominant children?
Oh, I think it's just because they do. It's. I think it's in the program in the kindergarten in a lot of daycare in Quebec, and that's just they just decided to do it like that, and that's also something that they like to do for fun. You know, making songs like rhyme. So as you, so it is dependent on the educational or the care context. So if it's in the program at the daycare, we want them to be able to identify simple rhymes. But if it's just not something they do in daycare, then it's not. They're not, you know, delayed in any way. So it varies a little bit for French dominant children because it's very often done at daycare. But if it's not done in their daycare, then that would be fine. So sorry about the precision. I forgot that it was there. And we had another question for a 4-year-old and simple rhymes. Do we mean that rhyming individual words or putting words together, putting together two words or more sentences ending in rhyming words? So because of for a 4-year-old, I would really focus on words. So if they're nursery rhymes that they know by heart, of course, go ahead, because then you kind of know them. It's just that if it's too long, it's going to be hard for them to keep in mind. At 4-year-old, they don't have a very long working memory in most cases. They can be impressive, but I wouldn't expect that that it's gonna work better with words. And especially if you know that it's something that they're trying to learn, trying to keep short words is also going to be useful. For example, 1 or 2 syllable words are going to be easier to find a rhyme than 4 syllables word. Was that did that answer the question? Very good. So we had 2 tiny paragraphs left to integrate reading into your child's life. So you can, as we were saying also earlier, read yourself. So when children see adults read, they enjoy reading more and they're more likely to read just because they kind of take it for granted that it's something that you do. So it's a really good idea to just lead by example and surround your child with books. So there was I think it was you a little bit earlier that mentioned that having books at home was one of the great ways to encourage kids to read. So surround your kids with books, make sure that reading is a habit, go to the library, browse bookstores, include books in daily living, keep books in the kitchen, in the car, in the bathroom, in the bath, anywhere. It's always a great idea. And, you know, I would also add, doesn't really matter what they read, well, as long as it's something acceptable. But a lot of the time, kids are going to be interested in stories that have monsters or ugly witches or talk about poop and stuff like that. So I would say whatever they want to feel like reading, let's just go with what their interest is, and then they're going to move on to more interesting thing as they grow. But whatever they read, as long as they enjoy it. A family I work with, so it was this really cute boy who was struggling with reading, and his dad realized that he could have him read the lyrics to the songs he loved. Of course, they were the type of songs an 8-year-old would enjoy. So even if he thought they were the silliest song in the world, he just printed out the lyrics and they read them together. So whatever encourages them to read, we can just go along with that. And one thing leads to another. And the little quick tips that for many children, especially boys as they get older, nonfiction books are more interesting than fiction. So it's not true for everyone, but it's true for a lot of them. So it may be as simple as changing the type of books you're reading together, maybe introducing books similar to the Guinness Books of Records with full of fun facts and stuff they feel like are maybe a little bit more connected to everyday life can be a good way to help them enjoy reading. So that's it for going over the handout. I did a whole lot of talking. I don't know if we have any other question that people have, or Audrey, how we're doing with time.
We're pretty flexible with time. I don't really have a limit, so.
I would, I think what could be a good compromise would be to go with, this would be the great time to ask any more question you might have. And if not, if we start another thing, it's going to take a good while. So I think that now could be the good time for wrapping it up and going with the last few questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What is a good approach to introduce a third language? So if, I mean, I speak I speak another language, not perfectly, but I would like to introduce a third language.
Mm-hmm.
Any tips? Is there an ideal age? I would like to start doing it now. My daughter's 3.5.
Yeah.
Tips that you could give me about that, I would appreciate.
Yeah, that's such a good question. What's the other language you want to explore?
Well, I also speak Spanish and Portuguese, so I think Spanish is the next one.
Yes.
I would like to introduce.
Yeah. So, we were saying earlier that language and culture are things that really go together. So what can be a way to, do both at the same time would be, trying to make it fun by introducing the culture and the language at the same time. It sounds very cliche, but it can be fun to do. I don't know, let's say that you do Taco Tuesday and let's have a Mexican night where we try to talk Spanish as much as possible. Or maybe it was the November 1st, which is Dia de los Muertos. And then it's a good time to, let's read, sometimes we can find books that have like one page in English, one page is Spanish. We're just saying it's not necessarily the best idea to go from a language to another, but reading it in a language and then in another to compare. So that can be an interesting way. What you have to keep in mind is that ideally, so kids learn by model. So you want to give them the right model. So try to stay in your comfort zone with that language. Really makes sense, because if you know that you're if you know that your Spanish is enough to speak for a simple conversation, then it's not necessary to elaborate so much and trying to, if you know that you're gonna make sentences that have mistakes in it, then it's probably best to refrain. That's the only limit I can think of. And if not, I would just try to, as we were talking with Raymond earlier, trying to make it through quality moments so that they can enjoy both the language and know more about the culture. I think it would be an interesting way to bring it, because it's, the more the merrier. Really, there's no downside to bringing another language. So I think that trying to show kids that it's okay to speak a language, even if you don't master it to the point where you could live in that language any day and it would be just as good. It's good to show them that you can explore languages even if you don't master them fully. That's also something that's really nice to show them.
Thank you. I just have, one more question to tag on.
Yes, of course.
So one thing I started doing is like reading her short stories in Spanish. Like we have one book that we have in English and in Spanish, but should I start introducing like a word here and there? So I'll read the story and we'll look at one word, like that story focuses on numbers. So we'll go over all of the numbers in Spanish, but should I just be introducing words here and there, or should I just like start speaking to her in Spanish and see what happens?
Oh my gosh, that's such an interesting question. I think that both have upsides. And especially with languages, so there are some things that are good things to do or to avoid. But aside from that, I think I think both could be interesting. Dependent, as we were saying, it's all a matter of what's the amount of effort that the kids are gonna tolerate. So, for some trying to do a whole story in Spanish, maybe they're gonna feel like they've been thrown in the deep end of the pool and they're not gonna enjoy the story as much. But if you feel that maybe she's gonna go along with it and learn some stuff along the way, why not? So I would say to go with, trying to, it's okay to have a little dance where you try to get out of the comfort zone, but at the same time you don't want to go too far out so that they don't get discouraged. So I think that's an interesting dance to do with kids, and I wouldn't be worried to try different stuff and see what works best.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other intervention in that area? Maybe some people have tips they want to share.
Well, just to go along with Audrey's question and as well, the third language learning, I was wondering what your feedback would be. Audrey had shared one of the techniques or strategies she's used by parroting when her child says something, parroting it back in English. But in this case, say if we're exploring a third language, what would you say about that strategy? If we're having our Taco Tuesday, we can't expect the child to be able to speak right away, but by parroting them back what they say in the third language, would it be overwhelming, or is that an effective way of learning and teaching and exposing them to it?
No, I think that's a super good idea. I didn't think of that thing, but that would be a great idea to try it, Oh, if you were to ask me, can I have the salsa, please? You could ask it like that, and try to put it in a way that you're giving them tools and not just like, this is how we speak, the bringing it in a way that makes it fun for them, of course. And not to say, Audrey, that you were saying this is how we speak. I think that what you did was actually amazing, and that's how you maintain that, that language alive in your relationship with your daughter. And I think I'm really actually super glad that you're able to share that experience with us, because it shows that even if it probably was tiring for you to do that systematically, that really gave her a lot of good model, and now she's comfortable talking in English. So as long as I'm bringing it up in that way for the third language, because sometimes kids can be like, oh, this is just something silly that we're doing tonight. So showing them that why don't you give it a try? You can ask me the salsa like that. So it can be a fun way to introduce them to language. And we were you were mentioning the kid stories, so that's a super good idea, because even if we have a kid that's a little bit older, but we want to read a simple story together in another language, then we can take a story for younger kids, and sometimes we're going to have the benefit of something that's not too complicated but still entertaining. So it could be a good idea to play with that as well. Mary was asking also about certain phonics that have to be heard or learned before a certain age, or they cannot be mastered. Best to try to introduce early, if only they get to their ear used to hearing it. I would say so. There's truth in that, obviously, because the actual hypothesis that's widely accepted is that we're kind of like born with a brain that's so flexible that we're just going to adapt to whatever language we hear, and then we start to categorize sounds. And if we grow past a certain age without hearing some sounds, then we don't have that mental category. So it is true that it's going to take more work, but it is also something you can learn later. So I would say that it's always a good idea to introduce, you can never be too young to be introduced to a language. So there are many reasons to do it. And probably there are some aspects, some subtle, information of language that are going to be more easily acquired the younger kids are. But it's also something you can, if you want to, that you can work on when you're older. So it's not dramatic if it didn't happen when they were really young for any reason. They can still work on it when they're a little bit older if they feel like it. Any other question that in that regard for you, Mary? good. We have any other leftover questions? Well, I think that's gonna be it for tonight. What do you think, Audrey?
I think that's great. If there's no other questions, I thank you very much for the talk, Geneviève. And
thanks everyone for being here.
Yes, and you mentioned earlier
sharing.
you would send us those the sheets you were showing us.
Yes. So is it okay if I send it to you and then you can relay them to everyone who was in the talk tonight?
Absolutely, yes. I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Wonderful.
So thank you so much. And oh, I see, hang on, something else. Oh.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I just had, when I was young, my parents did not speak English, but I was in English school. And then just maybe it can be helpful, my story. So I had a Chinese friend, and then she started to learn me a little bit Chinese. So we were talking French, Chinese, and Indian too.
Wow.
So it was, we were understand what we were saying, but the others, it was a little bit more difficult because we were in the same sentence. We were speaking 3 or 4 language. So what I can say is, if it's fun, it's begin to be easier to speak more than 2 language. So that's my thought. That's my experience too. So that it's the only thing that I can say. It was very fun. We have fun together. So nobody can really understand what we were talking about. So it was just, we were proud. So
right. And thanks for sharing. That's a great example of how code switching is not necessarily a problem in itself. And that, you know, talking many languages can be something that's done for fun. It doesn't mean that you're confused or that you don't master it. It was just your little personal code between friends that was fun to have together, right?
Yeah, exactly. And now I'm a little bit more than 40, and I remember most of everything I learned with these friends. So so I just learned a little bit to my little girl that, okay, it can be fun. We can do the things the other ways, just to be sure that she's learning a little bit more, because sometimes it's a little bit more it's difficult to her to learn her powers.
Yeah.
We start to learn them with steps. So we were in the, if she have a good word, she had a good answer, okay, you can move up, you can go upstairs. Each good answer, she excuse me, I'm not talking often English, so
that's okay.
So that's the same thing that I'm using with my little girl. So we have fun, and it's a little bit easier to learn.
Absolutely. And just like Sue was mentioning, you know, it's not a problem to be thrown into the deep end as long as it's fun, filled with fun. I think the attitude, and you know, that's something we can do as adults, just the attitude we bring to it and see it as play. Because really the big takeaway from tonight is that you don't have to be worried about confusing kids by exposing them to more than one language, as long as you know that you're giving them a good model. As we said, the more the merrier, and keep it fun and light, and they're gonna probably want to explore more and more.
Yeah, so I want her to be proud, and then now she's a little girl that she wants to speak English and French, and she's very proud because she knows that her grandmother and the rest of the families don't understand English. So sometimes she just speak English just to show how she's good. And then that's good because she's learning and she loves to learn. So that's the way that I see things. So
absolutely,
it helps.
yes, it does. That's a great example.
So thanks a lot for tonight.
Well, thanks everyone for sharing. That's what makes these talks so fun, right? Everybody can share the experience and share their tips and questions. And especially, I think, really also keeping in mind that it is the case for most children on the planet that they're exposed to more than one language. So there's really nothing to gain from trying to be too stiff and be too really in one language only.
I just want to make a little comment on something you had mentioned and Sumin had mentioned, just the idea of fun, because I know, like, for my daughter, she's not crazy about learning her letters, but if I turn it into a game, then she loves it. And I just get creative and I figure out different ways to turn it into a game just to keep her engaged. Otherwise, we can't get past like 3 letters without her kind of, yeah. So games, just keeping it fun, turning everything into a game so that they don't start associating learning language with like a chore or anything like that, where it's more of a game. And yeah, like Sumin's saying, kids learn best through play. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Oh, Mary's saying this is where computers are good. What do you mean, Mary? Oh, for computer games. Okay, yes. Absolutely. There's tons of great games out there for languages and apps and different things too. Yeah. So do you have anything else, Geneviève, that you'd like to share, or anything anybody else would like to share before we wrap it up?
That's it for me.
Fantastic. So thank you so much. And I will be emailing out to all of you what Geneviève will send me. So have a fantastic evening. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thanks, you too.